Hey everybody, I'm Patrick. I'll be talking to you today about starting a growth team, how to set the foundation for a high-performing team. You should watch this video if you're thinking about starting your own growth team or are looking at different ways to make your existing team more successful. But first, a little bit about me. My background is in design and product. I'm most recently based out of Seattle, but I've lived in Sydney, San Francisco, and San Diego. I've worked with some great companies. Most recently, I'm the co-founder of Iteratively, a startup focused on helping teams capture reliable analytics that they trust. But previous to that, I was the design manager at Atlassian on Jira Software and on growth. I've kicked off some growth teams at multiple companies, and I've learned a ton along the way. Most of this is going to be me sharing my experiences learning the hard way, often with me trying to conquer the world and falling flat on my face. We'll cover a bit about the growth process and why you might need a growth team, how to get one started and off the ground, and recommendations to take it to the next level. First, let's go over what we mean by growth here. Growth is the process of applying the scientific method to optimize customer and business metrics. It could be revenue, acquisition, retention, engagement, or anything else. Traditionally, you form hypotheses, you launch experiments, you develop learnings that inform future hypotheses. This is a very cyclical process. It's very simple, but at the end of the day, it's hard to do well. So how is growth different from building product? Product teams are often focused on building out the core value, the features that makes folks sign up for your product. Product teams might run some experiments, but often they're placing bigger bets on new feature innovation. While growth teams are focused on trying to connect customers to that core value as often as possible. This typically involves optimizing existing funnels or growth loops, but in some cases can involve building out new features entirely as well. But before we begin, it's important to ask yourself, are you ready for a growth team? One of the most common ways that startups die is premature scaling. You start spending significant amounts of money on growth before you have discovered and developed product market fit. If you don't have product market fit, don't add fuel to the fire. If you try to scale without ever getting to the point that the product is delivering on its promise to customers, you're setting yourself up for failure. You don't have to have everything figured out, but the dogs have to be eating the dog food. So how do you know when you have product market fit? Most folks will tell you that you'll feel it. It's going to be an innate reaction. Customers will be banging on your door. Customers that you have signed up will be highly engaged and singing your praises from the mountaintops. But if you want to take a more measured approach to it, you can use the Sean Ellis framework for finding product market fit. Recently, the CEO of Superhuman wrote a great post on First Round Review about how his team used Sean Ellis's survey to help them find product market fit. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. How does this work? You do this by asking your customers to fill out a survey. The key question being, how would you feel if you could no longer use our product? Once you analyze the responses, you're better able to get a sense of if you're delivering on your product's promise. For sustainable growth to be achieved, you need at least 40% of your customers to be very disappointed if your product went away. And out of those who've answered they'd be very disappointed, you want to learn everything you can about them, why they consider your product a must-have. This feedback will help you iterate on your early product and identify the right market segment to go after, things that are critical for being able to build out a growth team and sustainable model. But one of the surest ways to measure product market fit is to look at your product's retention. If you're pouring water into the top of the funnel, but your users are leaking out the bottom, it's a clear indication that something is off. Measure the percent of active users over time by cohort. If you're on your way to finding product market fit, the cohort retention curves should move up and become flatter over time. If your startup has weak retention, keep iterating on your product and doing the hard work of improving it prior to spending any time spinning up a growth team. You can also look at baseline comparisons within your industry for what average retentions look like, but you definitely want to make sure that you're on target before spinning up a growth team. So to recap, don't spend money or time on growth, which is around optimization, when your product needs a step change in a different direction. So make sure you have product market fit. Okay, with that being said, let's assume for the time being that you have product market fit. You're an established companies, customers are loving your product, you can feel it in your bones. What's next? Well, it's time to get that sweet, sweet growth that everybody is craving. So let's spin up a growth team. That'll definitely solve the problem. I was being a bit facetious there. Having a growth team is not a magic bullet. It's not an overnight solution, and it should not be the entirety of your go-to-market strategy in your pitch deck. Growth amplifies the value that the product team is creating, and it's hard fucking work. But let's assume that you're in it for the long haul and you aren't looking for some simple growth hacks. Let's get to it. There are many ways to structure, organize, and implement a growth team. This isn't going to be an all-encompassing, but I'll try to give you a good overview of how I'd approach the situation. But you might be asking, what about me or my organization? Like all great questions, the likely answer is, it depends. I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but it does depend on your specific situation. And there's no perfect answer, as each has its own pros and cons. The best structure for growth within your organization is going to depend on your culture, your business model, and the stage of the company. I'm also happy to answer any questions. Feel free to book some time with me on Growth Mentors. Happy to be helpful. But firstly, when you're starting a growth team, it's probably going to feel a lot more like this starting out. Things are going to be on fire. Anytime there's organizational change, people get nervous. That is common. So find ways to mitigate it by communicating early and recruiting allies within the organization. Additionally, not everyone believes in data. Some folks would rather trust their gut than rely on data, or have data tell them that they're wrong. This is especially difficult if you're in an organization without leadership buy-in. This can be the biggest roadblock to establishing a growth team. When you start shipping experiments, teams often feel threatened. They'll push back because they feel like they're losing control over their customer experience. There's plenty of product teams who, once growth starts actually shipping experiments that are touching their customers, have had many freakouts, a lot of panic attacks. This is a delicate line to tread because you don't want to alienate folks. So make ownership clear from the beginning and provide opportunities for feedback. Bring them along on the journey with you. But before you can start spinning up a growth team, you really need to understand your growth model and the problem your growth team is solving. So what is a growth model? A growth model helps you understand the levers you have available to your business to grow sustainably over time. You can map out it and fine detail the inputs and outputs of each lever to quantify the opportunity. For example, a lever for Yelp in their growth model could be a user-generated content SEO loop. When users add new reviews, that creates additional content that can be indexed and ranking, bringing in more users to the platform. So how would you use this lever to actually build out a growth team? We can think about how we would structure a team whose mission is focused on SEO, or a team whose mission is focused on new user acquisition. Therefore, SEO is just a tactic that they have available to them. Once you understand the growth model, you can start to rank each opportunity and pick which problem is the most important to solve at this time. You want to make sure that the team's mission is unique from the marketing and product orgs, and that there's a clear metric that the team can own. Second, make sure that the metric is clear for them to own, because you want to make sure that there's accountability for that growth team. Okay, so let's look at Team Gemini as an example. In this example, you're a growth PM who's reporting to the VP of product. Imagine that you're looking at your growth model and you observe that a healthy amount of users are signing up for your product, but they're not activating. There might be a variety of reasons for this, so you conduct some user research, and you found that the most common problem is that they don't know how to get started. So you have good leads, product resonating, but they just don't know how to get started when they land in your product. You decide this is a problem that you're going to spin up a team to solve. and you'll measure the team's impact by week 1 retention. So 7 days in the product, how many users are retaining? You establish a baseline and set a realistic quarterly target to improve the metric by 30%. This would result in an expected revenue benefit of X or Y. You want to make sure that you can actually quantify what the financial benefit for that growth team will be in the long term. This is extremely important to get executive buy-in to actually spin up and get resources in order to fund that team. You socialize this internally and you get buy-in from the functional heads to establish a team. What do you do next? Okay. Well, easy answer, you start building out the team. You're going to recruit a cross-functional team from within your organization. So there's a couple different ways that you can always hire. You can hire internally or externally. In this context, it's always easier to hire from within. So you need to go to your functional heads and get buy-in and get staffed accordingly for them. They know the product, they know the market, they have relationships internally, which are huge when you're just starting out. But be careful, because not everyone finds joy in this type of work. So I've seen many managers try to move folks who are underperforming out of their teams in these types of situations. So if you're spinning up a new growth team internally and you're trying to recruit from within, make sure that you're cherry picking the folks who are going to have an aptitude for this type of work and are going to be gel well within the overall structure of how growth works. So make sure you go in with your eyes wide open. So for Team Gemini, what are the key roles and skill sets needed? In this example, you'll play the role of the growth PM. You're responsible for the experiment roadmap and communicating the mission internally. Okay, and you decide that based off of the mission that you set out to achieve, that you need 2 engineers. Those 2 engineers are going to be responsible for implementing the experiments. They need to be comfortable writing throwaway code, as 90% of experiments fail. Perfection is not what we're looking for here. We're looking for people who can get shit done and move really quickly. You also need a designer on the team who's responsible for conducting user research and working with the team to design the experiences that you're testing. This person needs to be excited about working within shorter feedback loops and the impact that their work has on the customer. Traditionally, designers usually work on more larger facing holistic projects. You want a designer who's happy working in more shorter sprints on 2 to 3 day design efforts, not 2 to 3 week or 2 to 3 month feature efforts. These folks are kind of tricky to find most of the time. Additionally, you need an analyst to help provide insights on user behavior and analyze the results of the experiments. This is a hard job because any lack of trust in the data erodes the team's ability to operate and the organization's confidence in growth. Anytime you have a data outage or anytime you've misanalyzed an experiment, you basically set the team back about 3 months at least. So this is definitely a hard job to hire for, but it's definitely something that's key to the success of the team. And then you also need half a marketer who's responsible for messaging and customer communication. From all my experience in growth, the most important single contributing factor to the success of an experiment is messaging. Messaging in of itself is a craft, so getting somebody on the team who is an expert at that craft is extremely important. For the 0.5 and 0.5 analyst and 0.5 marketer, you can't exactly split somebody in half. We're not barbarians here. So how do you do that? Most of the time, the reality of the situation is that you're begging and stealing resources from other teams within growth. So be prepared to ask for a full-time person, but get less than what you expect or anchor high. Those are all really good strategies for when you're actually spinning up the team. But be prepared to get half an analyst or half a marketer. Okay, so what should you do trying to suss out when chatting with folks to see if they'd be a good fit for working on a growth team? How do you make sure that you recruit folks that have an aptitude for this type of work? There's some key traits that you'll want to be on the lookout for during the recruiting. Firstly, are they impact driven? But how do you know? I typically look to see when they're describing previous projects, if they're talking about customer or business impact. What results did their work produce? So if you're talking to an engineer who's talking about scale or refactoring or code quality, and not how those translated into customer impact, it's not usually a good fit. Although those folks definitely have more value in other types of teams, specifically product teams. What metric were they trying to move? If it's not clear when somebody told you that they're spending 2, 3 months on a project, but they don't talk about how that was benefiting the business or the customer, usually not a good fit. Um, Also, if they're using vanity metrics, not a good fit. Another thing that I index on, but it's likely based on my own biases, is are they competitive? Are they a poker player, college athlete, video gamer, so on and so on? I think these are really good indicators of people who are very impact driven and like to compete. Okay, secondly, can they move fast? I'm not advocating for jumping in and executing without really understanding the problem here. When I'm talking about moving fast, I'm advocating for hiring folks who know when they have enough information to proceed, even if it isn't perfect. You don't want to hire folks who get stuck in analysis paralysis. But on the flip side, you also want to make sure that they're good at their craft and can actually get the job done. So, and then thirdly, do they think with data? This is a hard one to hire for. Typically, I ask, when was the last time you used data to make a decision? What was the impact of that decision? What would you have done if no data was available? This lets me know a bit more about their working style and how they think with data. This is probably the biggest indicator in my mind of folks who have previous experience working in growth teams. This is the one that usually stands out to me. And are they a creative thinker? Most often in growth, it's important to think in terms of first principles to distill a problem down to its essence. A lot of at certain points within growth teams, you'll have already captured all the low-hanging fruit, and once the low-hanging fruit is gone, it's really hard to go deep unless you're really thinking in terms of first principles. So can they articulate pros and cons of each solution? Are they able to counter-argue against their position? These are all signs that they'll be able to excel in a growth team. And then lastly, but really important, is do they have grit? Working in growth can be pretty stressful as you're often dealing with rapid change. You don't always have the benefit of knowing what you're going to be working on from one week to the next. Priorities change and you might be expected to wear many different hats throughout the day. This is exciting, extremely exciting for some and nauseating for others. So make sure you align expectations and they know what they're getting into. And most of this is based off my experience interviewing and hiring folks for growth teams. And this has worked relatively well in the past. Great. So now that you got your team, if you're in the Bay, you now have $1 million team. So now what? Growth teams are expensive. So it's very important to make sure that you're rationalizing the decision to invest in a growth team versus doubling down in product or in any other focus area that you could have as a business. But so you have your team, it's time to get storming. What are you going to do? You're going to come together, conduct some research, ideate, and come up with a bunch of different experiment ideas that you can prioritize and execute on. There's actually a lot more to it than that, but this talk is on starting a growth team, not on running one. So I'll pause there. So that basically gave you sort of a simulation of how you might go about creating a growth team within your organization from recruiting within. You are a growth PM who is reporting to the VP of product and you recruited a cross-functional team from within the organization. Well, this is pretty common. There are other models for growth teams that you could have adopted. I find that scenario probably the easiest one to grok for somebody who hasn't done this before. It's also the easiest one to sort of champion internally if you're that, if you are that type of person. For the cross-functional team structure, this is the easiest way to get started for a variety of reasons. One, because you're consolidating resources and work that is likely already happening within the organization. Additionally, it's the easiest change to unship if for some reason things don't work out. You're not changing managerial lines. Each team member still reports into their functional head. So worst case scenario, the team dissolves. Everything sort of just goes back to the way it was. The other sort of structure that you can have within the organization is an independent team structure. This usually involves hiring a VP of growth or promoting somebody internally to that role. In this model, all engineers, designers, analysts report into the VP who is responsible for the P&L. Well, this might sound like a more clear-cut structure. See, often it's the hardest one to spin up because like within most companies, resources are limited. And as we learned, growth teams are expensive. So make sure that you're really justifying the cost and the value that those teams provide. Thirdly, there's always really hybrid models that you can actually approach as well. I've seen marketing teams have their own growth team and product orgs try to have spin up and have their own growth teams as well. At some point, as you scale, you'll likely want to consolidate efforts as there will be more focus needed on building out growth infrastructure, data analytics, reporting. There's going to be more focus on managing the experiment releases, making sure that you're not cross polluting experiments, and creating cohesive customer experiences. So things that stretch beyond customer acquisition all the way into retention and activation. Okay, so that was a lot to digest. Again, if you have any questions on that or if there's any specific scenarios that I can help with, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to jump on a call. Okay, but lastly, I want to share some lessons learned that can help get you off the ground with the growth team. These are things that will make your lives probably much, much easier, and you won't have to be landing on your face like I did. Okay, firstly, in order for growth to succeed, you have to align the organization. It requires getting pretty much everybody on board with spinning up the growth initiative. And to give you some background, starting an organization previously, I was trying to spin up a growth team. We spent about 3 months doing it before it was canned. And specifically, the failure that I had on this is I didn't align the organization and the different cross-functional teams needed in order to actually have this growth team be successful. So what would I do differently now? The best way in my mind to do this is to be constantly talking about the mission and the role of the team within the organization. This could be at all hands, at brown bags, during one-on-ones. Always be talking about the process and the work and the value that the team is providing. Your job is to really evangelize the process so folks know what the growth team is doing and get them excited about it. Make it visible. You want to have your metrics on wallboards. You want your mission printed out on the back of the bathroom door. You want everyone to know what the team is doing. Again, at even a small size team in the Bay, it's $1 million a year. There's a lot of people that are going to be vying for those resources. So in order to really make it successful, make sure that everyone knows what they're getting out of that. This also works great if you're recruiting folks internally to join the team. One of the tips that I'd recommend is try to do secondments with folks to sort of rotate through the growth team. It's a great way for folks to really try out the growth process, see if they like it, if they want to stick around. But additionally, it also helps evangelize that process once they go back to their other teams, so they know sort of what it is that you work on and what's that process that you follow. And another thing is, as you analyze experiment results, make them public. I'll be surprised at how many times I've seen growth teams try to hide failures, or if you're running high velocity experimentation, you're running 15 experiments a quarter, and you only get 2 or 3 successful. Those are the 2 or 3 that you talk about. You don't talk about the other 12. You want to make sure that out of those 12, there's learnings that you can actually share. Like, how do those inform future hypotheses? How do those form future wins that you can actually run? This helps build trust within the team for one. It also makes it, you'll see less pushback over time. So when folks think that like, hey, this is an experiment that's running, it's going to get, it has a finite, this is the outcomes that we're trying to drive, you'll get less pushback once they see that like, hey, I've learned this thing and we've moved on and we've hardened the process. And just because you have a successful experiment doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's going to ship. And then most importantly on this, I'd also say, you need CEO founder buy-in. This should be the first one that you try to tackle when trying to kick off a growth team. If they're not bought in, it's going to be an uphill battle, and you're going to be hitting your head against the wall. Okay, secondly, don't try to take on the whole world at once. Start small and build momentum. So we talked about the growth model a bit. You're going to have all these different levers that you can actually focus on, and picking that initial lever, building out success within that growth team, building out that muscle, getting everyone humming is super important before you try to take on more. So let's imagine you focus on new user onboarding. You build out some experiments, you get some early wins there, focus on that for a bit. And then once you've actually proven yourself and you've proven out the team, you can either make a bid to expand out, get another team, get another growth team on board to focus on, let's assume, acquisition instead of activation. or you can grow the team to actually take on more responsibilities in other places within that growth model. But make sure you get some early wins under your belt prior to taking on the whole world. Okay, and lastly, know when to hit pause or change direction. It's okay to refocus on the core business if the market shifts. This has actually happened to me multiple different times where you'll be working on a growth team and either the business priorities will change or the market below, underneath the business will change, and you'll have to hit pause. And that's completely fine. A lot of the times it's pretty disruptive to the team, but it's okay to move those resources and those folks onto focusing on a different area for the time being, or doubling down onto getting a launch out the door and then bringing them back to sort of focus on growth. I know this is really disruptive to folks, but a lot of the times people see this sort of the end of growth. That's not necessarily the case. So at Jira Software, we ended up pausing the growth team for over a year to double down our efforts on rebuilding the product. And once we launched that new product, we were able to actually convince leadership that we needed to bring back the growth team. The growth team was brought back on, and they were spun up later that year as well. So it's okay to pause and focus on the core business if that's the area that really just needs the most help at that point. Again, one of the other things that happens quite often is a team will sort of hit their local maximum. They'll be banging their heads on a problem, they'll sort of capture all the low-hanging fruit, and at that point you have to decide on doing more innovation testing, trying to test more radical ideas, or moving them onto a different focus area. There's a lot of pros and cons with doing that. I'm in favor of moving them on to, again, if you think about your growth model, you're going to have a stack rank of all the different priorities and focus on top priority. Once you've made some progress there and you've hit the results that you're expecting, move on to the next biggest priority. That's my preference, but really mapping out that growth model becomes really important to sort of see the inputs and outputs and actually being able to determine quantitatively where the team should be focusing their efforts. Okay, and that's it for me, folks. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm available to chat on Growth Mentors, or feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Here's some helpful resources if you have any more questions. I've outlined the growth process at which we followed at Atlassian on my own blog. There's Andrew Chen has a really good blog post on how to build a growth team, and then Conversion XL has a really good blog post on why not to build a growth team. So the counter arguments for this as well, and then Reforge has blogged a ton about this as well. So thanks so much. Have a good one.